Hi, my name is Sandy, and welcome to another webcast with Ancestry Roads, where the stories of Appalachia are. I'm really excited today because it is such an interesting and unique topic for Appalachia in the Civil War era. And what we're going to talk about today is divorce. We're going to talk about being heartsick and astonished, divorce in the Civil War era in West Virginia. It is edited by Allison Fredette. Dr. Fredette is a history teacher with Appalachian State University. And I want to point out that the book is now for sale. This is not a pre-release webcast. The book is for sale, and we're going to share that link with you in just a moment. And I want to take a pause for a second and just say that we'd like to dedicate this webcast to Kevin Fredette, who is archivist at the West Virginia and Regional History Center. We're going to talk a little bit more about Kevin in just a moment, but we wanted to make a special mention because he was integral to getting this book where it is today. Let me tell you a little bit about our guest. So Dr. Allison Fredette, again, is assistant professor, of history at the Appalachian State University, the author of Marriage on the Border, and has chapters in Rethinking American Emancipation in the Quest for Black Freedom in West Virginia History in the Journal of Regional Studies. So let's go ahead and bring Dr. Fredette in and talk a little bit about being heartsick and astonished. Hi, welcome to the webcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am fascinated by the topic, and you do hit one of my favorite states, West Virginia. And from somebody who researches West Virginia, has researched West Virginia for well over 25, 30 years, I am fascinated. I had no idea about how Wheeling, West Virginia became such a hotbed for divorces. And I do need to say, when we say hotbed, back in the time, I just feel like divorce was a bad word as opposed to modern times we're at now, where sure, let's just go to the courthouse and file for divorce papers. You see it on the newspaper rags for the famous people. You hear about it from your neighbors, things like that. But back, and we're talking about around the 1863-ish time frame, divorce was not a word that was thrown around a lot, was it?
No, it definitely was not. And when I was doing this research, I always had to kind of balance out the fact that I feel like there are some important trends here, but the number of people who are getting divorced is still fairly small in the overall population, nothing compared to what we have today. And what divorce looks like is so entirely different from what we see today. What you're talking about, what we would see today, so much more often is a couple filing for divorce using no-fault divorce law, which would mean no one is to blame. It's just they don't want to be married anymore. And in the 19th century, in the vast majority of cases, and in all the cases in West Virginia, you had to have someone at fault. So it was fault-based divorce. So someone had to be blamed for a divorce in order for you to get it in the first place, which is very different than today.
Now, would you say that women actually brought the cases to divorce equally as the men did?
Actually, oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Actually, in a lot of cases, women brought more divorce than men. So in the cases that I look at, they're a slight majority, if not 50-50, but overall in the country at this point, other divorce historians have shown that women file as much as 2/3 of divorce cases. They have a lot more to gain from a divorce. They have a lot more at risk reputationally, but legally they have more to gain. Because in the 19th century, when a man married, his legal status doesn't change in the eyes of the law. But when a woman got married in the United States or in England, because it comes from English common law, they lose a lot of their legal rights. They lose rights to property. They lose rights in courts of law. And so by filing for divorce, they earn that back. So they actually have sometimes more need for a formal divorce than a man might.
See, I think that's fascinating that they earned that back, because I know as a professional genealogist for most of my career, unfamiliar with them losing everything. Their land that they might have inherited somehow or they've gained would end up being the husband's property now. So I was fascinated to learn that they would inherit that back. And I'm also fascinated by this time frame. So for those of you that are watching this webcast might not be familiar with US history, we are really on the cusp, I would say, of women's rights in this particular region and in the country. And we're really getting into the point of talking about women's suffrage as well and the right to vote and having the more rights. So for those of you that might not be familiar with the US history, this is really an interesting book to get you started on the fight that women have for just certain things. It could be the right to vote, but it could be the right to have their life back. And we're not always talking about abuse either in this book. I think a lot of people might think that this book is full of divorce cases of abuse, and that's not so either. That's an interesting point that I want to bring out. And we're talking about the Civil War. Their husbands were gone for a very, very long time. And some women were lonely and kind of created a brand new life with that. So the stories are fascinating. I highly encourage, and I'll have my producer drop the link to buy the book. The stories are fascinating because it gives you a snippet of that, little life period. And as I read the book, I find that some things never change as well. So that was kind of fascinating as we go through. Okay, so tell us, why would you come up against a topic of divorce, being heartsick in the Civil War era?
Well, how did I come to divorce? So, well, it's kind of a long meandering route. So I am from West Virginia, which is in large part how I came to study West Virginia. I basically, when I was in my master's program, I was reading a lot of books on this era of the Civil War, leading up to the Civil War itself, and after, and thinking a lot about the North was doing this, the South was doing this. And I got really intrigued by the idea of West Virginia as a place that was in between. And so I really wanted to study what it meant to be in between these kind of two opposites at this point. And so then at the same moment, I became really interested in women's history. And I wanted to look into West Virginia, of course, becomes a state during the Civil War as well, in 1863. So I thought, well, this is a perfect moment to study how are they, as a place in between, how are they treating women? And I thought about looking at married women's property law, but it had actually already been done. So I was like, well, someone's done that and they did it well. And then I decided I would look at divorce because it's another aspect of family law that really deeply affects women. As you mentioned, it's something that was integral to the women's rights movement at this point. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848, and the vast majority of her kind of demands in that are about marriage and family law. So I basically decided that divorce would be a perfect kind of way to blend my desire to study women's history and my desire to study West Virginia as a place in between.
And you mentioned a couple of things that I want to point out. It's interesting that you mentioned you're researching the North and the South. And for those of you that do know West Virginia history, you probably instantly had the little light bulb that went off in your head because West Virginia and this became where it is now because it split off Virginia specifically because one had northern views and one had southern views. So when you mentioned that, that was one of the first things that I thought of. There's your two different separations. The other thing to mention too is, with Cady Stanton, I think she would have got much further if the war didn't happen. The war kind of put a little bit of a pause in there. But what was very interesting in your book is when West Virginia was setting up their laws, they did take a lot of Virginia, but one of the ones that they really wanted to look at and change was women's rights. I had never known that. about West Virginia that they specifically argued on their house floor about it. I mean, I was fascinated by the comments.
Yeah, that was a great moment when I found that exchange in the constitutional debates where they sit there and they talk specifically about how Virginia had never really given women enough legal rights.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy who hit that the hardest, the legislator who hit that the hardest, was from Wheeling, which I think is not a coincidence when you look at these cases. And he's someone who might even have seen or known about some of these divorce cases. So he would have been very familiar with that. But yeah, they specifically, when they're talking about their women's property law or their divorce law, they look to New York. They actually are happy to look to northern states as a model.
With me, with this webcast and switching over to what Ancestry Roads is changing the narrative of what people think of Appalachia. West Virginia is the only state that is fully in Appalachia, and it seems to be an easy target for those who don't know Appalachia and an easy target just in general with West Virginia. So it's fascinating to me that they were progressive. They were very, very progressive at the time. And as you mentioned, they looked to New York. They looked north to some state that even today people think is super on top of things, super progressive. They look at all rights. And West Virginia didn't look towards the South, where, as we know, that African Americans and women did not have rights. So I just find that fascinating. I'm so thankful that you included that little bit of transcript in there to show how progressive the state was. Before we dig into Wheeling, let's talk just a minute or two. Before the Civil War, what were my rights as a wife? Did I have the ability to divorce easily? And let's just take Virginia, because that's where West Virginia was at the time.
So in Virginia, you would have had the right to file for divorce. Generally, especially in the South, it would have been recommended that you file with a next friend, which would mean because you're a married woman, you don't have as much legal recognition in the court. So you'd probably bring along like your dad or your brother because they are like, seen as better in the eyes of the law.
Yeah.
So they would help you file. And in Virginia specifically, you can file for two types of divorces. One, which is an absolute divorce, which is what we would think of as a divorce. You are divorced and you don't live together anymore. You have no legal ties. But most of the people in Virginia actually file for the second type of divorce, which is a divorce from bed and board, which means you don't live together anymore. But you can't remarry, and in some ways you're still kind of like financially responsible for one another. It's more like a separation today. And basically in Virginia, to get an absolute divorce, you had to prove adultery or that your partner had gone to jail, or that you'd never been able to consummate the marriage. So there were like basically like three reasons, and that was it. And then everything else kind of fell into that lesser type of divorce. And so those would have been your options.
Were they successful?
What?
Were they successful?
So it depends on where you look in Virginia. In Wheeling, they generally are successful. So the two things I found interesting in my other book, Marriage on the Border, I look at counties in Virginia proper and in what becomes West Virginia and in Kentucky. But in looking at Virginia versus West Virginia, in West Virginia and in Wheeling, they're filing for that absolute divorce the vast majority of the time. Whereas in what I would call Eastern Virginia, they are often filing for that lesser charge. And so I kind of had this debate where I was like, either everyone in Wheeling is just rampantly committing adultery against each other, or they are picking that charge because they know they're more likely to be successful using that. Because that is the one that most often, that if you charge someone with adultery, you are likely to get a divorce. Whereas courts are a little more skeptical of abandonment and especially cruelty. Like they're people filing for cruelty, but they don't see it as something that necessitates a divorce as much.
No, and if you think back to that time frame, punishment, I guess I'll use that word. It's a hard word to think of when you talk about a husband and wife situation, but I would say punishment was the word that some husbands would use for abuse on women or their children. And I can see where courts would probably think that was a natural right of a husband to. So I can see where it would be more difficult to get a divorce based off something like that. And again, we're talking about right now, we're leading into the Civil War, and the abandonment is kind of tough too to deal with because they're going to say, but they went off to war. Before we go in a little bit deeper to after the Civil War, I do want to read just one little bit from your book. And I talked to Allison about this beforehand. The book is fascinating for so many reasons, but I was shocked, I guess just to say maybe astonished, by this one bit that you found and included in the book. And it says, while all English, this is pretty much pre-Civil War. So while all the English settlements adopted the common law and its accompanying view of married women's rights, differences emerged in attitudes towards divorce. The Anglican Church, for instance, dominated the Chesapeake colonies, which are going to be, where the water is basically, which inherited the church resistance to divorce. Meanwhile, in New England, Calvinists, such as Puritans, took a much more liberal view of divorce. And I did say liberal view of divorce than their Anglican counterparts did. And I love how you put this. It seems ironic in many ways, but in the colonial era, if people found themselves in an unhappy, abusive, or unfaithful marriage, their best hope was to live in New England. And it just blew me away as I thought about that because I I can see the map, and if you know United States history and pre-colonial times, you know that, Maryland is extremely Catholic. It's gonna be extremely Catholic. You're gonna see a lot of Catholics come in as well to the Virginia ports. It's a little bit mixed into the Pennsylvania, but when we talk about New England, like we were saying before the webcast, Puritan, it's a word that means a lot of different things, but it does not mean divorce. So it's just little snippets like this that I learned so much from you and what you put into the book. So the fact that West Virginia looked north for their laws again kind of plays into they were looking at the women or the couples that were unhappy, abusive, or unfaithful in their marriage and what to do with it. Now let's talk about the war. We were in the war, and the men go off to war. Some don't come back, and there's not a need for divorce in that case. But some come back and find that their wives started a new life with somebody else. So that was fascinating that you included that in the book as well.
Yeah, it definitely there's kind of a range, and I tried to when I looked on those new relationships, I tried to really put myself in some ways in their shoes or really think on them with a lot of empathy. Because I think it would be easy to kind of see them in a salacious way of like that, their partner's gone, so they're having an affair. But I think that there were cases in which I really saw them as so much more than that. In the Strobel case, which we talked about before this
Mhm.
started, it's a case of a man going off to fight for the Union Army and then his wife taking up with this other man. But their relationship, in addition to like, it's probably based on the things all relationships are, but she's clearly also looking for someone to support her financially,
Mhm.
realizing like these are women often most of the people in these cases are not well off. They are working class people, and so for her, with her partner gone off to war, she doesn't have anyone to support her. Theoretically, soldiers can send back money, but as I see in a lot of these cases, they don't.
Yeah.
They
No.
don't get a lot anyway, and many of them don't send that money back. And so she's just thinking practically in some ways too. I need someone here to provide for me.
And a lot have farms. There's
Mhm.
a lot of work on a
Yeah.
farm back then. We don't see that as much in even modern technology back then. It was a lot of work. And the thing about struggle that was so interesting is they went out to the local eateries, to the pubs, to the town, to the market. Uh, but they knew she was still married. You
Yeah,
know,
they went over and had dinner at her family's house. Like they were not hiding it.
so and it was just accepted. I mean, the way you presented in the book was fabulous. They were just accepted as what it is. And then her husband comes back and says, "Oh," and then if I remember correctly, the husband filed for divorce in the
Yeah,
struggle for struggle, right?
he files for divorce and then they are divorced and he remarries within a year. And from what I can find in the records, it seems like that the two, Ellen and the man, John Hunter, who she took up with, that they get married as well because they are listed together in the census a few years later.
A few years later. And we were talking before. I want to point out for the genealogists that are watching, you want to know why this book fascinates me as a genealogist? This gives a record to the women. We don't normally get that too much. In looking for any records in the late 1700s, early 1800s for anybody in, what are the United States, this is challenging. For women, it's near difficult to find information. A lot of times when they got married, sometimes they were listed on the bands and the bonds, sometimes they weren't. If they were living on a farm or if they were remote, they didn't worry about birth certificates and death certificates and burial information. I know that I have so many people that had come to me as a professional genealogist said, "Can you tell me where she's buried? We have no record of her death and no record of her burial." As today, if you get a death certificate, it's going to list the parent's name, it's going to list the wife's name, it's going to list all the causes, and it's going to list the dates and where they were buried. Women didn't have that back in the early 1800s. So this book gives us a snippet of how to find the women. So for those of you that have possible, female ancestors you're trying to find and you come across something strange like, "Oh, well, her name was Strobel during this census, but now it might be Hunter during this census," look for a divorce. It could be a divorce. And this was such a light bulb moment for me. I never ever thought to look in the cases for divorce. I thought maybe land records, maybe marriage records or something like that. So for the pro genealogists out there, this is another avenue I bet you'd never thought of as well. So then let's go ahead. I guess the thing that we need to talk about now is Wheeling, West Virginia. So the Civil War is ending and Wheeling is it. How did Wheeling become the focus of your book?
So Wheeling became the focus in some ways on purpose and in some ways by accident. I think that Wheeling, what I'll say purposely why I think Wheeling works is that it's important to understanding the state of West Virginia. It's the first capital of West Virginia. They kind of switch back and forth between Charleston, which is now the capital today. It is unusual in the South and in Appalachia because it is an urban place. Its economy is based on factories and industrialization. It is an incredibly diverse community. You can see that in these cases. A quarter of the Wheeling population was foreign born at this point. So, I mean, there's a huge population of immigrants in this community. You can see free Blacks moving throughout the community, interacting with white divorce people who are getting divorces. So I thought Wheeling would be a great place to study West Virginia and to study the urban South and Appalachia. But also West Virginia. Well, so when you were talking about divorce cases being this really great resource, and I really think they are, I use these myself when I teach women's history and women in the law here. I think they're such a valuable resource. And a lot of states are digitizing their divorce records. The state of Virginia, for instance, has done great work, the Library of Virginia. But West Virginia would, if they had them now, they would do great things with them, but they don't have them now because they, for a long time, were stored in local courthouses. And from what I've heard in the 1930s during the Great Depression in the United States, in order to basically cut costs, they got rid of a lot of their old records. And so divorce cases got thrown out in many cases. There's also a law in West Virginia that divorce cases are sealed forever.
Oh, that's yeah.
Yes, which is wild. So I actually filed FOIA requests in some cases to try to find other counties' divorce records. So I contacted court houses and filed Freedom of Information requests. And I would get them, and then the courthouse would finally tell me, well, actually, we don't have anything. So what happened with these is that these specific divorces made their way somehow on a microfilm into the West Virginia collection in Morgantown. It's this Ohio County, where Wheeling is the county seat, and Brooke County, which is just north of it, are the only ones in the West Virginia collection.
Oh my.
And my dad worked at the West Virginia collection when I was getting my master's, and he knew I was having this dilemma that I was talking about earlier, where I wanted to study women's history and I wanted to study West Virginia. And so he actually brought me like the old school drawer from a card catalog with the names, and then said that there's this microfilm that you can look at, which has all of these on it. So in some ways it was a great place to study because it has a lot of good things, but in some ways it was also just the only place I could study divorce in West Virginia in this era.
Yeah, that's amazing. And this also brings us back to who we dedicated the website to, because your dad, Kevin, brought this information to you. Like you said, brought the old styles, like, go fish on microfiche pretty much. So that's kind of also why we dedicate the webcast here to him, because he was kind of the start of the book. And as an archivist, he probably had a lot of information to share too, or where to find. It's really disturbing every time you hear about records being destroyed. Of course, we're talking about Civil War, and you hear about courthouses being burned. And I think if you have family in Appalachia, especially Virginia, sometimes Georgia, you're going to come across that. But to hear that just, courthouses said they got to go. We need room. Who's ever going to want this stuff?
I know. It breaks my heart.
Oh, it's crazy. So, and in Wheeling, it was a really progressive town at the time. You have the river there, so you have a lot of movement coming up, and it does need to be said probably again that you did have a lot of free slaves coming up, trying to go out of the South and work their way north as well through this. Well, I guess let me ask you then. I did ask Allison to pick three, and we talked a little bit about Stowell. So pick three cases. I had a really difficult time picking three. I could sit here all afternoon and we could do case studies on every single one because they were unique. They had a common thread a little bit, but they were unique as well. So we talked about Strobel and Strobel, where the husband went to war, came back, and saw that the wife had a whole new life without him, with somebody else. What's the next one that you picked for us?
I picked the case of Wells v. Wells, which was Levi and Christina Wells. It's antebellum, so it's before the Civil War. It's an adultery case where she's filing and charging Levi with adultery, which he definitely did commit. In some cases, it's a little more unclear. But why this one is definite is that, unlike a lot of these, and this is part of the reason I picked it, in most of these cases, you get a bill or a petition where someone will file for divorce, and then you have depositions. And those are fascinating and so useful, but they can be manipulated. Whereas what I like about the Wells case is that they actually have a letter that he wrote from where he was in jail, and he wrote a letter to his mistress. And so he hands it to the jailer and asks the jailer to deliver it to his mistress. And the jailer instead basically sends it along to the court. So I don't know that Annie, his mistress, ever saw this letter. It's in its own way, it's a lovely sentiment in his letter. But but it's a letter where you can see his feelings for Annie. You can get his kind of true feelings and perspective outside of the legal documents. And I also think it just shows the class again of the people in these, because his letter is written like someone, he's literate, which is unusual at this point in the South.
Mhm.
But he is barely literate. You can tell through his spelling. He has no punctuation. It's just all one sentence.
Oh, yeah.
That he doesn't have a lot of education. But so I think it's just so powerful, and to kind of see here in his own words. And then what I also found useful about it is he basically is saying to his mistress, don't worry, I will get a divorce. And to see, because I was trying to show that Wheeling residents were filing for adultery in order to manipulate the court system and get a divorce, even though Virginia law was restrictive. So to see him saying, like, don't worry, my wife's filing for divorce, it's going to happen soon, was kind of that evidence of that collusion that I was looking for.
And it's funny because you're talking about pre-Civil War as well. And so it's just fascinating. The word divorce doesn't really come into a pro-genealogist's thoughts at all. Now we will look at divorce records, but back then we wouldn't. So what was the outcome? Did he end up getting the divorce?
He did. They were divorced. So the court granted them the divorce. And in that case, I wasn't able to track that either of those people after the divorce, unfortunately. But I'm just gonna assume this isn't a very historian thing, but I'm just gonna imagine that he and Annie ran off and were together.
I mean, if he was kind of crazy enough to write a letter in jail to his mistress to, confirm this is, yep, I did it. This is me.
Yeah, well, he also says something like, I could get out tomorrow if I went back to my wife, but I would never do that.
I think it's funny because I can see somebody doing that and saying that today. I absolutely can. So it's really interesting to me how sometimes we think something doesn't happen in the past, but it did, and we're just copying what the past has done. Okay, let's talk about the next one. What was the next case that you picked and why?
So first of all, it was really challenging for me to pick cases. And in fact, one of my favorite cases isn't even in the book, I will admit.
Well, now you're going to have to tell us about that next.
Yeah. But the one I did pick, Griffith v. Griffith, is Martha and Charles Griffith, and it's post-Civil War. It is one of the cruelty cases that I have. And as I talked about before, it's not successful. And that, again, with a domestic abuse case, it's hard to know, is that because the court doesn't allow it, or is it because the couple reconciles?
Mm-hmm.
Because that does so often happen both then and now in abuse cases. And why I chose this one, though, first of all, it's very long. Some of the they vary in length. Some of them are quite short. This one has a lot of depositions, and it's probably because this is one of the wealthier couples that I have in here. He runs a tobacco store in Wheeling. So, and he's said to be worth about $16,000, which would have been a lot at this point. But he's basically, when she files, she's just had a baby. So she has a 2-week-old baby, and he has been going on what they call in the time drunken sprees. And then coming home, and a lot of the abuse they talk about is actually verbal and psychological. So insulting her, yelling at her. But you get this, I think it's this really evocative portrait of this woman who has just had a baby. I've had 2 children myself, like picturing this woman in the 19th century, 2 weeks out from having had a child and enduring this abuse from this man. But I also picked it because reading some of the descriptions the deponents give, it's very evocative. I think that sometimes when people think, oh, their legal documents or their court cases, they'll think they're very dry.
Yeah.
But they often read very compellingly. Like, there is one person who describes a night where there's a storm going on, and he's running in and out of the house with an umbrella, and they describe the lightning in the street and him going in, and they talk about the various things he's throwing around and what he says, and it's just very vivid in the picture that you get. And so again, it's an example of where this divorce case allows us to learn something about divorce, but it also is just another way to glimpse what the lives of people in the 19th century are like. A lot of the people testifying or giving depositions are servants. So, because again, it's a wealthier couple. So you get a little bit of a view of what servants might have experienced in these Wheeling, slightly upper middle class homes in Wheeling as well. So that's why I chose that one. But like I said, that one is a darker one, and it does not lead to their divorce, although he dies within 5 years of the case, and he is young. And so I don't know why that there's no, again, the limitations of 19th century records. I have no listing of why he died. I just know from his gravestone that he died.
And this one was really fascinating. I wasn't sure if you would pick this one because it is dark. And then I wasn't sure if you'd pick this one because it was long. I was hoping you would pick it because it is long. It is detailed. You get a little bit more, I guess, read between the lines with this one. But to me, this one case could also be a case study on its own into, as you mentioned, a little bit wealthier and how the courts handle that. I feel from my research that when somebody was wealthy back in this time period, the males in particular were handled a little bit with kid gloves a bit, and the wives were kind of like not believed type of thing. So this case to me gave me a little bit more detail than I ever thought I could ever find anywhere. And I was glad that you included this one in the book, but also to talk a little bit about it today. For me, I don't really, love reading cruelty cases. Who does? Or abuse cases. But for me, this ended up giving me, I think, the biggest insight to what was going on after the war and after the time. And like you said, 2 weeks, she's had a baby 2 weeks, and they talk a little, mostly about the verbal abuse and the emotional. There's got to be something more for her to bring this case. And that's the part that I keep reading. I keep reading, and I keep, it's almost like a mystery novel trying to unravel it and see what's going on. And I'm talking about just this one particular case. And it's fascinating. It shows, if you get the book and you only read this, which I know you're not going to, you're going to read the whole book, but if you get it and only read this particular divorce case, I think you'll totally understand the time period of what's going on, and you'll totally understand why women were fighting for rights. And I even get chills now talking about it, because I remember reading it back, and I get chills just thinking about, as you said, what she went through.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's where I think some of these cases, they're so evocative. I actually have like scenes in my mind where I've pictured them. Like I've pictured what her room looked like with her kind of in this post childbirth bed and him coming in. I've pictured these scenes. There's another one of cruelty where a woman describes being in a room with her children and locking the door, and her husband throwing dishes at the door. And I picture that one a lot too. So they give us a surprising amount of detail. Like I think that when my students go through them, they're often surprised at how much detail and how much private information that people are willing to just share.
I think that's it. You don't really hear private information at all from this time frame for couples. You sure don't hear it from women. At all. The silence, sit there, be silent, was more of what you expect. We see it in Hollywood, we see it in novels, we see it in books, but you also see it if you go tracing back through historical records. The women don't really have a voice. So when I got this book and I like devoured it, I was so surprised at the voice they had in the detail. So I think you're right. I would have to agree with your students that I was just really surprising. Again, coming at it from a pro genealogy is where I came to your book, as opposed to a West Virginian and an Appalachian. And that surprised me too. I usually attack these things from a pure Appalachian standpoint. And of course, being in West Virginia, but I did this. What you flipped me. You flipped me over to thinking about it more from a pro genealogist in the women's rights. And as you said, you can picture it. I can absolutely picture the women's rights movement around this time frame, probably in every location that women were around and in families or single and living their lives. This wasn't just West Virginia.
Mhm.
This happened too, but this is
Yeah.
where our case studies are. So I could absolutely picture the reasonings, the impetus of why women's rights started. So I thought that was I mean, I just didn't expect to be flipped, I guess is what I really I'm pretty passionate about Appalachia. I'm pretty staunch with it, and I bring Appalachia into almost every conversation, even at Starbucks or anything like that. But this one you kind of flipped, and we were talking about it as pro gens about where records are. So when you go back to your students, make sure to tell them that the pro genealogists were like thankful that we have records. We finally have something in the detail. And that's the other thing. If you look at census records for women, they were housewives.
Mhm. Yeah.
Men might be farmers, they might be shopkeepers, they might be, postal there's all different types of things. Women, they didn't have that. So to find
Yeah.
the details that you found through these divorce cases to kind of describe what their life is like in the family is a gold mine.
Yeah, and you hear from all different types of women. That's what I think, the
Yeah.
depositions come from women too. So even the women who aren't filing, the women are filing depositions and they're coming to the defense of their female neighbors. I was also, there are a couple of the cases deal with prostitution, because it was an urban environment. There was a prostitution industry, and you actually hear like they actually have prostitutes, sex workers testifying in these cases and telling what their experience was. And I think that again, that's something you never find.
You would never hear that. I mean, if you would probably hear it now just because it's salacious and somebody would talk
Yeah.
about it. You would not hear it in 1950. You probably wouldn't hear it in the 60s. Maybe 1970, you might know some of the words or terms, but you still would be publicized. But you're getting this information, pulling it directly from the divorce information that's at court. This was actually said aloud
Mhm.
court. In the deposition, somebody had to tell these words.
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating to me that I'm seeing a whole different side of later 1800s. Again, for researchers, for women, it's extremely difficult to come up with anything. So now I'm sitting here and I was thinking as reading the book, I need to now go see how to find divorce records. So now, where do I find divorce records if I was in, say, Kentucky or Georgia? Do you have any advice to share for us?
Well, so I am the thing I would say is every state is different.
Mhm.
That is one thing that's a little tricky. I mean, that's presumably true of so many genealogical records. But so I am familiar with where to get them in Kentucky and West Virginia and Virginia. I don't know as much in Georgia. Generally, my recommendation would always be to start with the state archives,
Mhm.
because the state archives, if you are lucky, the state archives have them. And if they don't, they will tell you and they will recommend to how to go about getting them. Most states at this point have sent them to state archives. So North Carolina also, for instance, North Carolina has them in the state archives. Um, Kentucky has them in the state archives. Virginia has them at the Library of Virginia, but they've digitized them all.
And
They
Virginia is probably the only one that has them fully digitized, I would
They're the only
imagine.
one I know of so far that has
Yeah.
them fully digitized. I know a lot of North Carolinas are, and some various other ones through the South were digitized a few years ago by a UNC Greensboro professor. Um, and that database is still available online. So if you do a bit of searching for the UNCG divorce petitions records, you can find some scattering of ones that are throughout the South, but it's not comprehensive. But yeah, generally, I would recommend going with the state archives. When you go into the state archives, they generally have them organized by county.
Okay.
So you'd have to look through counties. Sometimes they're going to have search databases where you can look by name. Um, and then sometimes they'll have them divided up by causes, but not always. So like when I went to Kentucky, for instance, the trick was that I asked for like years because I was trying to pull all of them, and they had all of the circuit court cases together, which
Oh.
meant I had to weed through. So basically, what I did was to find just divorce records. I looked for ones where people were suing people with the same last name, but then I had to go through those and decide which ones were property cases because there are so many cases of people fighting will disputes and things
Yeah.
like that. So I just put those to the side and then pull out the divorce cases. But if you have a specific name, a lot of state archives will be happy to scan it also and like send it to you, sometimes for free, sometimes for a small fee.
And the fee
Um,
usually is small, and you do have a good point there because if you're looking for something and they can digitize it for you,
yeah,
it's not going to just be for you anymore. They're also going to include it on their archives and then their online. So you might be pulling a family name or one or two cases from it, but you're helping further other researchers along the way. I do always tell people a couple things with records. Indexing is done every day. So if you don't see something today, go check next month, go check next year. Indexing and digitizing happens all the time, all day, every day. People are doing it. Sometimes they're paid to do it. They work for the archives. Sometimes they are volunteers. So always keep looking. If you come to a dead end today, chances are you will find something eventually. But what Allison pointed out was something that is probably your best resource. If you cannot find anything through your typical record search, it's not digitized, it's not indexed. Go to your states that you're researching, go to their archives or their historical societies. Sometimes the local, I found sometimes the local and the county is I haven't found for divorce cases, but if you're looking for a specific name, sometimes they have histories that are brought down through the years, through generations of ancestors. Not technically a source, a primary source, but it is helpful to go dig. So if they did say in the family histories that have been given to local societies, county societies, city societies, that there's a divorce, then I would take that information that year and then I go, like Allison said, straight to your state archives and look at it that way. I think it's fascinating how you wrote this as a history. You were interested in women's topics, and then again, you brought us along for the ride with the ProGen. So I think that's really fascinating. Again, we're talking about before the Civil War, kind of a little bit during and after the Civil War. So we're talking right there around 1850s to 1870, that range of years that we get to dig in and sit in a courtroom and watch what they said pretty much by reading your book. And how often can you do that to find out about an ancestor, the neighbor to your ancestor, somebody in the same town? If you've got a one place study or one name study, these are awesome sources for that I never thought of. I never ever thought about divorce cases. So I was fascinated to come across your book.
well, thank you.
And then I guess let's go ahead and end the webcast with just a question that is an easy question to answer because I don't think there's a true answer to it. But so collectively, what do these cases tell us about? I'm going to tell you, you need to read the book to find out what it tells us about that time frame. So that's the first thing I need to tell about. But what do they tell us collectively about this country that fought and now reunited and moving forward?
Well, I think that for one thing, it tells us that that reunification process is a little more complicated than just the North and the South. And again,
Mhm.
you see West Virginia as a state that's kind of got its foot in both worlds, trying to strike a balance that both has to do with the Civil War itself and then also has to do with things like part of the reason they're talking about how they're annoyed that Virginia never had anything about women's rights is they don't like Virginia, like for non-Civil War reasons. West Virginians still to this day not crazy about Virginia. So there's more going on here than just the war itself. And then in terms of the longer trajectory of divorce and women's rights in American history, I think that what I teach a class on the history of marriage here, and I talk a lot about how people tend to believe that marriage used to look a certain way. And when they have that view, they tend to, what they're actually picturing is what it looked like in the 1950s, was that everyone got married, everyone married young, and everyone stayed married.
Yeah, and that's not true.
It's not true. That actually is only really true for the 1950s.
We were talking about that beforehand too.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating to me that back around the 1860s, late 60s and early 1870s, they were divorcing people. They were divorcing in 1950, Ozzie and Harriet stayed together.
Yeah, exactly. So I think American history is a lot more, it's not it's not constantly getting better or constantly getting worse. It's just always up and down. There are these ebbs and flows. And so I think it really challenges people's view of what the 19th century looked like, and especially the 19th century South and Appalachia, as you mentioned, to kind of show people that Appalachia is more than its stereotypes, that it did have this place for women to come to court who were upset with what their husbands were doing and divorce them and move on.
I don't think I could say that any better. And I want to point out that what Allison just said is, again, changing the narrative of Appalachia. What you thought Appalachia was, we just learned from this book. It wasn't what we thought. The women were sticking up for themselves. They said, okay, I've had enough. I need to go to court. The case that we described at the last, she didn't win the case, but my gosh, did she have courage to go up there. And as a wealthy couple, she could have lost all that wealth. Yeah. She could have not lived the life with servants in a nice house and everything. And she just had a baby 2 weeks. So I'm like, my gosh, the courage of all of them, men and women, that came to the court back then to openly discuss their private problems. I'm astonished. I really am astonished. And I got to tell you, thank you for coming to the webcast. And also thank you for helping to change the narrative on Appalachia, because this does.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
And I want to thank everybody who's watching live. I know that we have a global audience today. So I want to thank you that's watching live. And if you're watching us after the fact, thank you for coming and joining us. If you have any questions, then just check out the descriptions down below, which also has where to buy the book. Definitely, when you buy this book, this is one of these books that you're not going to put down. These are not super dry legal cases that are boring and, oh, I don't understand the legalese, I don't understand what's going on. This book is nothing like this. This book is really intriguing. It lets you in on a time frame of Appalachia right after the Civil War, which we don't hear about the women very much in this. We know the men come back and reconstruct their lives, and they become shopkeepers. They start working. I think it's also the Rust Highway that we talk about. You start to see the industrial age come about, but we don't hear about the women much. And this book gives you a little bit more insight into family life as well, in changing the narrative of Appalachia. So thank you for joining, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. I appreciate it for you coming to talk a little bit more about Heartsick and Astonished. Okay, bye, guys.
Bye.